Okay, we are now live. I leave it to Ivo to start the Domino talk introduction.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Hi, and welcome. I'm very happy to introduce you to today's Domino lecture. It's hopefully it's going to be a very exciting and fresh and invigorating discussion that we're going to have today. And the title of our Domino lecture is Resurrecting a Spectacular Hero, Diriliş Ertuğrul, Necropolitics, and Popular Culture in Turkey. And I would also like to very briefly take a minute to introduce our guest speaker today, Josh Carney. So Josh is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Media Studies at the American University of Beirut. His work focuses on the media from Turkey, with recent projects on popular television, cinematic censorship, and the role of media screens in public demonstrations. His teaching includes courses on the mediation of national history, visual culture, cinema in the city, and media theory. Josh received his PhD in communication and culture from Indiana University in 2015 and joined AUB in the fall of 2017. For those of you who are interested in Josh's work, he has a website also, which is quite easy. It's joshlcarney.com. So feel free to check it out after the lecture today. So once again, a warm welcome to Josh, and the microphone's yours. So welcome, and we're ready to listen to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Ivo and Erkan for organizing this, as well as BİLGİ University and its Media and Communication Systems MA program for hosting the talk. I'm excited to share my work with you all, and I look forward to discussing it with you. I'm going to try to share the screen now so you can see the slideshow. Okay. I'll assume we're good there.
Yeah.
Ya Rab, seni kendime vekil yapıyor. Azametin karşısında yüzümü yere sürüyor ve senin uğrunda savaşıyorum.
Sorry, folks, that was not full screen. Let's try that again. Today, I trace some of the ways in which resurrection has been used instrumentally by the AKP government, blurring traditional distinctions between entertainment, history, and policy. After providing brief context for the serial, I introduced the notion of prescriptive activation to describe the extra-textual use of media text by those in power. Next, I turn to the trappings of death that surround resurrection, suggesting that the serial partakes in a representational necropolitics that fetishizes death for the nation. Finally, I explore the stakes of such representation, turning to a case in which text-inspired and literal necropolitics converge. To start with a bit of brief context, resurrection is part of a much greater trend in which TV has been courting audiences in Turkey with representations of the past. This includes, broadly speaking, two rather different targets, the Republican past and the Ottoman or Neo-Ottoman past. There are key differences between these targets and the kinds of struggles they excite, and I'll be happy to say more about that topic later if you're interested. I've done some work on the success and failure of the Ottoman-themed shows, most notably Rebellion, which was a government attempt that resulted in consummate failure. The various shows can be seen as a reaction, in some ways, to the success of Magnificent Century, which was very popular, but also excited great anger. I suggest that Century elicited these reactions in part because it circulated within a current of relatively reflective nostalgia, breaking taboos on sacred figures, while other serials failed because they attempted to respect those taboos, partaking in what Svetlana Boym has termed restorative nostalgia. In terms of controversy, Century came under attack from none other than Prime Minister Erdogan in November of 2012. Erdogan was concerned, among other things, with the lack of time that Century's Sultan Suleiman spent on horseback. So it may come as little surprise that the government's later effort, Resurrection, features many scenes on horseback. The show has been a huge success, and in a related paper, I suggest that this is because the producers have picked a character who is little known to history, and thus subject to fewer taboos. This freedom was coupled with marked improvements in creative team, cast, and crew to make Resurrection a stronger all-around production than previous efforts. Such investment led the serial to a solid premiere in 2014 and to runaway success in subsequent seasons, where it topped ratings and often broke records with audience shares in excess of 40%. The government's investment in the show wasn't just financial, nor was it limited to the realm of popular culture. Indeed, evoking Resurrection for political purposes began soon after the series premiered. In January of 2015, for example, when President Erdogan greeted Azerbaijani President Aliyev outside the new palace in Ankara, the band played the Resurrection theme song. The upbeat tune has since become ubiquitous at both government and AKP-sponsored events where it's used to rally crowds. And here's an example that some of you are likely familiar with.
Fantastic.
So the music is there, but music is far from the only use of Resurrection by the government. On these 29th of May celebrations in 2016, for example, Turkey was celebrating the 563rd anniversary of the conquest of Istanbul, with a ceremony attended by President Erdogan. The theme for the event, Resurrection Again, Rising Again, Yeniden Diriliş, Yeniden Yükseliş, evoked the serial's name, and two of the special guests were actors from the show. Cengiz Coşkun and Nurettin Sönmez took stage in full costume to reprise their roles as Turgut Alp and Bamsi Beyrek, two of Ertuğrul's closest confidants. The anachronism of 13th century characters on parade at the celebration of a 15th century conquest may be striking, but it's entirely in keeping with a restorative nostalgic outlook that partakes in what Edward Said calls one of the key tropes of Orientalism, the notion of a timeless East. Indeed, the message Coşkun and Sönmez delivered was, much like the political ad with which I began, one of continued Turkish dominance from the ancient past to the present. These examples provide some taste of how Resurrection is used by the government for purposes well beyond the realm of entertainment. But how can one best characterize this would-be repurposing of popular culture? I'm not here addressing the kind of political message contained within the text. Like most popular serials in Turkey, and indeed probably to a far greater extent than many, Resurrection is rife with political commentary on contemporary Turkey. For example, much of season 2, which aired from September of 2015 to June of 2016, deals with the theme of brother being turned against brother in the Kaya Obası, the nomadic camp, due to meddling of outside forces. This includes betrayals of Ertuğrul and his family by those assumed to be friends, as well as trials based on falsified evidence. These plot twists and the numerous didactic speeches on the importance of brotherhood and the danger of outside interference delivered by Ertuğrul and his mother Jaime Hatun can be read as a commentary on the contemporary breakdown in order brought about by fallout between the Gülen movement and Erdogan's AKP. Such messages are certainly worthy of their own critique, but they fall outside the scope of my present interest. I am instead interested in the extra-textual ways that Resurrection is brought forth to engage a public, because I believe they may shift the effective relationship people have with the text to other purposes. Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle approaches the issue. For Debord, our everyday lives are increasingly overtaken by spectacles, leading to questions about the nature of reality that have strong political implications. While Debord's spectacle was preoccupied with eradicating historical knowledge in general, we might consider the ways in which history is subsumed rather than eradicated by the spectacle. Jonathan Crary has tied Debord's spectacle to Foucault's notion of discipline and is in line with Crary's understanding that I offer the notion of a prescriptive activation for a text. I base this loosely on what Tony Bennett has called the productive activation of a text by readers and viewers. While Bennett's productive activation is quite useful for ethnographic work with textual publics, I here focus on the government's purposeful use of the text and advance the concept of prescriptive activation, the extra textual attempt by a producer to activate a text among its publics in particular ways. For those primarily interested in media studies, I think this notion is the key intervention I'll make tonight, as it provides us with a handle of sort to grasp emergent forms of world-making and transmedia storytelling, particularly those working at political ends. Events at the rallies I mentioned above are useful to provide some clarification. While the Turkish government sponsors a rally that includes the resurrection theme song and actors who make clear reference to their roles in the show, this is a prescriptive activation because the government is guiding members of the public towards an understanding of the text and its greater social significance. When fans at these rallies bring and wave blue flags bearing the E symbol ascribed to the Kaya tribe, this is in line with Bennett's productive activation because the agency rests with the viewers or the participants. Both of these activities can be said to blur some of the lines between entertainment, history, and politics, partaking in the society of the spectacle described by Debord. One question this raises, particularly in the case of prescriptive activation, is what direction does this guidance take? What is the government doing by foisting this TV show into the public well beyond the purview of its primetime TV slot? The title of the series is one indicator, Resurrection. Before tackling the broader significance of the title, it's worth noting a paired set of meanings that are clear to those viewing the serial in Turkey. First, the title is a reference to the story arc of the central character. Though relatively little is known about the historical Ertuğrul, the serial's plot includes the near complete destruction of the Kaya tribe by Mongols and Ertuğrul's subsequent rise to leadership. This is just one of numerous resurrections that Ertuğrul and his people go through over the course of the serial. In a similar vein, the slogan from the 29 May celebrations cited above, Resurrection Again, Rising Again, suggests that the show parallels the AKP's rise to power. The resurrection here is thus entwined with contemporary politics, specifically the idea that the AKP represents the resurrection of Turkish greatness, that Erdoğan is Ertuğrul. Or, as I argue in the larger paper, Ertuğrul is Erdoğan, since the sparse historical notation leaves much room for AKP improvisation. But why is resurrection the key process at work? Both the serial and the government insist on this terminology. I believe that the frequent and public use of both the term resurrection and the serial resurrection by the AKP is symptomatic of a broader necropolitics in Turkey, a fascination with and championing of death on behalf of the nation that has stark implications for everyday life, politics, and even the nature of democracy practiced there. In his pioneering theorization of necropolitics, Akili Mbembe draws on Foucault's biopower to offer an understanding of politics, sovereignty, and subjectivity that looks not to reason, but instead to the poles of life and death, and who wields the power to determine them. As he puts it, my concern is those figures of sovereignty whose central project is not the struggle for autonomy, but the generalized instrumentalization of human existence and the material destruction of human bodies and populations. For Mbembe, slavery and colonialism are key instances of historical necropolitics, while the occupation of Palestine, characterized by territorial fragmentation and siege warfare, is a clear contemporary example. As an aside, let me note that I just finished reading Banu Bargu's recent edited collection, Turkey's Necropolitical Laboratory, and it provides a host of excellent discussions about this broader trend of necropolitics in contemporary Turkey. Though it covers a striking array of topics, it does not touch on the mediation of necropolitics in popular culture, and this is where I'll turn for my first pass at necropolitics. Mbembe is concerned with a literal politics of physical death, and this is a point I'll return to. But for the moment, I'm interested in a representational politics of death, a normalization, spectacularization, and even celebration of death in everyday life, chiefly by means of media. These ultimately serve to foster what Raymond Williams calls a structure of feeling, a kind of emergent culture of a period. I think resurrection is clearly implicated in this necropolitics. In late February of 2015, a few months after the show premiered, Turkish troops crossed the border into Syria to recover personnel and artifacts from the tomb of Suleiman Shah. One soldier was killed in the operation. Suleiman is Ertuğrul's father in the serial, and perhaps also historically, though this is less clear. In the TRT version of history, he is the patriarch of the Kaya tribe, a key figure of reverence, and though he dies towards the end of season 1, he continues to visit characters, memories, and visions in subsequent seasons. The full paper explores the political context for this raid, noting that the government had likely considered using the tomb for political purposes in the lead up to municipal elections in 2014, but ultimately did not. While Suleiman Shah's tomb was only a footnote to the 2014 municipal ballot, it was front and center a year later, as the AKP faced its most serious political challenge to date in the June 2015 parliamentary vote. On the night of 21 February, close to 600 troops entered Syria through the Kurdish-held town of Kobane with tanks and other armored vehicles. They evacuated the Suleiman Shah enclave, which housed 38 Turkish soldiers at the time, took all articles of historical interest, and destroyed the remainder of the site to prevent its use by the Islamic State. One soldier died in the operation under circumstances that are still unclear, though there has never been a suggestion of hostile fire. A new tomb was constructed just across the border from Turkey, near the Syrian village of Ashme. The pro-AKP media declared Operation Shah Euphrates a stunning success, with such fanfare that some media critics compared it to a Hollywood production. Main opposition parties, however, critiqued both the loss of territory and the cooperation with Syrian Kurdish forces that the operation presumably entailed. One key difference between the 2014 attempt and the 2015 success was that the media environment had changed considerably. By February of 2015, Suleiman Shah had become a household name in Turkey thanks to the popularization of the character on Resurrection. The tomb and its defense became increasingly relevant at a popular level when the ancient character associated with them was fleshed out and brought to life on a weekly basis. The spectacle here is twofold: popular TV serial on the one hand, media frenzy over a military operation on the other, all in the midst of an election season. At the level of necropolitics, it is not simply the focus on a long-dead hero and his resting place that are of interest. These are in keeping with baseline nationalism that is common to many countries. Rather, the apparent willingness to consider attacking one's own country and excluding that, the theater of putting 600 lives at risk for a tomb to literally raise this person's remains from the grounds, attest to a politics steeped in death on both ends of the historical divide. As an aside, let me note that this operation provides a counterpoint to what Bargu and some others in the edited book have called necropolitical violence, those acts which target the dead bodies of those killed in armed conflict. What I see with the Suleiman Shah tomb is the Janus face of such violence, and that might rather be called necropolitical reverence, referring to acts that make use of the dead bodies of national heroes. Returning to the raid, ultimately the government either put the lives of many soldiers at risk for negligible gains or pretended to do so while denying political coordination and touting the danger and bravery of the operation. We're faced with a necropolitics that is either representational or literal in terms of the present danger, and grave-diggingly real in terms of the past. Regardless of intention, one soldier died in the operation, making the theater of death quite concrete for at least one family. This was not the only case where resurrection would be called upon to mediate necropolitics. Starting the day after the July 15th coup attempt in 2016 and continuing for 23 days, the Turkish government sponsored a series of events that it called Democracy Watches, Democracy Nöbetleri, nightly public rallies in squares across the country where citizens would gather to demonstrate in support of democracy and to honor those who had died thwarting the coup. The timbre of these watches ranged from solemn to festive, but with greater balance on the latter end. Lively music, flag-waving, vibrant MCs, myriad politicians and celebrities were all part of the mix. Many of the events were staged for camera and broadcast across Turkey. They featured large crews and an infrastructure that included multiple stages, numerous giant screens, and camera cranes. The Resurrection March and Erdogan anthem, Dombra, were repeated soundtracks of these events, each played well over 10 times per night. Resurrection was also present in the form of myriad blue EE flags, which overlooked the crowd alongside Turkish flags, Erdogan flags, Azerbaijani flags, and occasionally Ataturk flags. And I'll play you just a few more minutes of what those watches were. This is from Taksim.
Allah hepinize razı olsun hepinizden dolayı. Mehmet Czervik, üstadımıza devredeceğim. Bir ateş olarak, bir ateşin kardeşiniz olarak şu dakika itibariyle radyocuların artık üstadı diyoruz biz ona. Siz onu gezegen Mehmet olarak tanıyorsunuz. Sevgili üstadım, sevgili abim ben sahneye davet etmek istiyorum.
The serial was further represented by its actors, who made frequent appearances at these events, exciting the crowd with messages about sacrifice and the honor of the nation. Lead actor Engin Altan Düzaytan, for instance, returned from vacation abroad to address a crowd in Üsküdar, Istanbul on 25 July, where he appeared alongside 4 other cast members and a writer for the show to assure those assembled that he never had and never would lose faith in his homeland, nation, or government. Mehmet Czervik, who played the crazy ironsmith on the show, appeared in at least 2 watches in the weeks after the coup to deliver long speeches about his sense of honor at seeing how the nation had responded. In both speeches, he referenced the plotting from outside that Turks have faced throughout history, tying the travails of the Kaya tribe to the greatness of the Ottomans and the challenges of Çanakkale, Gallipoli, and linking all of these to the moment of the coup. Czervik used his role as an actor, playing a key fictional character in the Kaya tribe, to speak with a kind of popular authority on the history of the Turkish past. His register was highly dramatic when doing so, and the appeals of this unique blend of celebrity, character, citizen blur to some degree what might otherwise be more distinct lines between history and present, fiction and fact, politics and patriotism. He used his stage to call out the bravery of those who jumped in front of tanks, and in a clear reference to those killed in the coup, he noted in one speech that graves in the ground are what define a homeland. It is in remarks like these that we see most clearly the valorization of death and its ties to the greater national project. Though graves had not even been dug at the time of the first Democracy Watch, a symbol of the dead was incorporated very quickly into the architecture of the squares. In at least 2 of the venues, Taksim in the center of Istanbul and the Yenikapı Assembly Field, where the final watch took place, a giant billboard listing the names of those killed in the coup, martyrs or şehitler, as they are referred to in Turkey, was positioned alongside the stages and screens. In the government narrative, the names are there to be honored and also to serve as a reminder of the cost of democracy. Various speakers evoked the martyrs, often tying them, like Czervik, to other historical sacrifices made by Turks. And yet the overriding tenor of the watches was not one of somber reverence for the dead, but rather celebration and solidarity. Nor were these dead, ever present in name, long the center of attention. In each of the cases I have mentioned, the wall of martyrs was positioned near the center stage, but its static list of names in text was no competition for contemplation next to large screens and the host of celebrities occupying center stage. Both in terms of architecture and ceremony then, the dead were brought next to the living and made part of everyday life. Their memory was present, but in this setup, it was the likes of Czervik who prescriptively activated this memory as part of a greater Turkish story. At the watches, the dead were collectively narrativized by the living. They were used in a theater that had far more to do with politics than individuals and remembrance of their lives. This isn't to suggest that the dead were denied ceremonies of memorial. It's simply to note how they were used at the watches. The role of resurrection in this theater was not subtle. Its ever-present music lent to the festive feel, Its flags waved energetically amidst the crowd, and its actors told stories that shaped the deaths into meaning. What I see with these activations of resurrection is an extension of necropolitics into the realm of popular culture, returning to Mbembe's formulation. The state of exception is key to the necropolitical order, and the democracy watches were part of the greater theater that was used to justify a literal state of emergency in which laws were suspended and power was further concentrated under President Erdogan for 2 years. The political ad with which I began was released amidst this state of emergency, and the constitutional referendum it supported was, likewise, voted under the same conditions. Erdogan reaped unprecedented powers as a result of his victory in that referendum and ultimately the election of 2018, which saw him confirmed as the most powerful politician in Turkish history. Resurrection and its representational necropolitics had a role in easing in this regime. Characters, music, actors, and other elements from the serial are held up as idealized history on the one hand, and brought immediately into everyday life and politics on the other. The generalized message here is of a great nation, but one sinister undertone is the continued prevalence and praise of death in service of this nation. In February of 2016, just over a year after Resurrection's premiere, Turkish soldiers left 2 notes and a 5 lira bill taped to a cabinet in a house they had occupied during the siege of Cizre, a Kurdish majority town in the southeast of Turkey. One of the notes explained, amidst forays into nationalistic and Islamist chauvinism, that the money was compensation for the use of the house. The house had been trashed. It was signed Sungur Tekin, which might have been a soldier's name, but also happens to be the name of Ertuğrul's older brother in the serial. The other note simply read, "Greetings from the descendants of holy warrior Ertuğrul." The context for the Turkish government operations in the Kurdish southeast in 2015 and 2016 was complex, as the government was concerned by the rising influence of YPG forces across the Syrian border, as well as an ad hoc autonomy that had been declared by Kurds in various towns in the region in 2014. But the greatest factor was probably electoral defeat. In the hotly contested parliamentary elections of June of 2015, the Kurdish-focused HDP had overcome a daunting election threshold to enter parliament as a party for the first time, dealing a serious blow to the AKP in the process. Rather than form a coalition government, President Erdogan and the AKP decided to up the ante of nationalist politics, aiming for another vote in November. The Kurds were the go-to enemy. In July, the government began security operations in a number of regions in the southeast. In August, a law was reinterpreted by the government to allow harsh blanket curfews, which effectively meant people could be trapped in their houses without food, water, or electricity for weeks on end. In numerous cases, those who ventured outside were shot and killed. These curfew areas, Diyarbakır, Silvan, Nusaybin, Cizre, Silopi, Dargecit, Yüksekova, and Derik, thus became siege zones in which an extreme state of exception was the imposed order. As an aside, please note that Haydar Darıcı and Serra Hakyemez have an excellent discussion of the situation in Cizre in the recent Bargubek book that I mentioned before. Some key moments provide a sense of the operation's macabre nature. In October of 2015, Hacı Lokman Birlek, a 24-year-old actor, likely militant, and brother-in-law to HDP MP Leyla Birlek, was summarily executed by police. His body was then tied by a rope on the back of an armored police vehicle and dragged through the streets of Şırnak as a warning to those who might collaborate against the state. I've blurred the body, but this is one of the images that came from that event. Images and videos taken by the officers shared widely on the internet. In December of the same year, President Erdogan said that Kurdish militants would be annihilated and that operations would continue until the areas were completely cleansed and a peaceful atmosphere established. December and January 2016 were indeed the months of heaviest operations, with numerous accounts of unprovoked killings of civilians, often mediated in highly counterfactual ways by state media. Throughout January, a crisis had been building with numerous people holed up amongst 3 basements in Cizre. HDP MPs and others had attempted to intercede with the government and believed they had brokered a deal when, on January 30th, Turkish forces attacked the basements, killing between 130 and 189 people, many of whom appear to have simply been fleeing other areas of struggle. On February 11th, the Cizre operation was declared a success. but the curfew remained in effect while the government bulldozed buildings throughout the area. The curfew was then lifted on March 2nd. The following month, the government issued an expropriation ruling that allowed it to seize property and rebuild large areas in multiple cities through the Mass Housing Administration, TOKI, including over 30,000 houses, as well as numerous factories, hospitals, and sports stadiums. And these are some images of some of the what took place during this time. On the red and blue image on the right, the red areas are those that are set for appropriation by the government. Estimates suggest that approximately 2,000 people were killed in the operations, including over 300 civilians, and that over 6,000 were injured. In addition, cases of torture and forced disappearance were documented, and journalistic organizations not closely aligned with the government were forcibly closed. The key elements of Mbembe's Necropolitics are the siege and the state of exception, both of which clearly pertained in the southeast. Likewise with territorial fragmentation, vertical sovereignty, bulldozing, and infrastructural warfare, all detailed by Mbembe. His ultimate conclusion that the state of siege allows a modality of killing that does not distinguish between the external and internal enemy, in which entire populations become the target of the sovereign, is equally applicable. The siege in the southeast took place before the coup attempt facilitated a countrywide state of emergency, exponentially expanding the number of those labeled enemy by the sovereign state and giving, for those able to and interested in accessing the news, a preview of the lengths to which the AKP would go to maintain sovereignty. The question of who was interested, however, is not an idle one, because concern over the operations in the southeast was constructed as a marginal viewpoint, and resurrection may have had a role in this. The handwritten notes that led this section were left by soldiers almost a year after Operation Shah Euphrates, and because they presumably came from soldiers acting on their own accord, they might be termed productive activations rather than prescriptive activations of the resurrection text. But the lines here blur because this was just one instance among many. Social media such as Twitter had been used to share pictures of security forces posing with graffiti in Cizre in December of 2016, and similar pictures of forces next to resurrection-related graffiti staged in other locations appeared in February and May of 2016. The notes and the 5 lira bill, however, became a news item as they were covered and commented on by reporter Nurcan Baysal in March of 2016. The following month, resurrection actor Nurettin Sönmez used the website of a pro-government newspaper, Yeni Şafak, to deliver a video message to the security forces in the southeast in which he praises their work.
Wow. That. Derviş kardeş.
Okumadan da ilim tahsil edilmez mi?
Kardeşlerim, hepinize selam olsun. Cumanız hayırlı olsun. Tüm Doğu ve Güneydoğu bölgesinde jandarma, harekatçı kardeşlerime, tüm güvenlik birimlerine selam ediyorum. Sizler bizleri ekrandan tanıyorsunuz. Bizler sizin yüreklerinizi, ecdadımızın o ruhaniyetlerini televizyon ekranlarından yansıtıyoruz. Bizler burada dünyanın şanına ve şöhretine nail oluyoruz elhamdülillah. İnşallah da taşıyabiliyoruz. Lakin inancım odur ki sizler orada maneviyatın şanı ve şöhretine nail oluyorsunuz ki biz her zaman buna boynumuzu büküp selam veririz. Allah her daim size kuvvet versin, yüreğinizi ferah etsin, göğüs kafesinizi geniş eylesin. Melekler ordusu daima sizin yanınızda olsun. Allah'ın nuru üzerinize olsun. Bileğiniz, bacaklarınız, sırtınız kuvvetli olsun, alnınız açık olsun. Hepinizi saygıyla selamlıyorum. Siz de duanızı bizden eksik etmeyin. Selam olsun.
The message is striking in the context of what had occurred in the Southeast. Once again, a figure from the serial was used to make direct comment on the politics of the moment, but in this case to sanction and laud the siege of fellow citizens. In the context of a harsh media crackdown, it's plausible that neither Son Mez nor his viewers were aware of the extent of human rights violations perpetrated by those he praised. But it's not clear that this would have made a difference, given the extent to which pro-government media had worked to construct Kurds as a terrorist enemy in the lead up to and aftermath of the 2015 parliamentary election. As de Board had noted on the link between spectacular democracy and terrorism, such a perfect democracy constructs its own inconceivable foe, terrorism. The spectators must certainly never know everything about terrorism, but they must always know enough to convince them that, compared with terrorism, everything else must be acceptable, or in any case, more rational and democratic. And it is in the spectacular mediation provided by Son Mez that we see the dawn of a full-spectrum necropolitics, a moment in which productive and prescriptive activations of the text merge, ultimately leading to a collapse of distinction between representational and literal necropolitics. I will end there with the talk and welcome discussion with all of you.
Sure, Josh, thank you so much. I mean, it's always very interesting, and it's also always quite, how should I say, it's heavy to listen to this, to this talk, because it's, when you put all the pieces together, the kind of the bigger picture that you see is, quite striking and shocking, And maybe one question I have, or one observation, when I was listening to you, and this is something I've had in my mind for a while now, is that, necropolitics seems to be the ultimate Faustian pact in a way for a politician, because, at one point it's a very powerful way to mobilize the masses, especially when you're talking, if you're a populist politician, to mobilize electorate, But also at the same time, necropolitics depends on a state of emergency, that there's always something happening, something that the masses need to be on guard against, and so forth, which makes it all out at the same time. It's a very effective tool, but it's also very kind of weakening. It has an Achilles heel, and that is that the minute the state of exemption or this emergency situation starts to become normalized, then it loses its effectiveness very quickly. So ultimately, for politicians to retain their sovereignty or to retain their regime, they constantly need to pump up or create these moments of crises, And this ultimately turns into a little bit of a catch-22, because people can't be on guard all the time, or they can't be mobilized all the time in this kind of a situation, but in a necropolitical sense, but also at the same time that I'm losing my train of thought over here. But I hope that you understand what I'm trying to say, that there is this kind of a strange relationship between embracing this kind of form of politics, which is very successful at making you win as a politician, but also kind of losing in the long run, or this necropolitical success is turning into something that's Pyrrhic ultimately. What do you think?
I think that's an interesting point. I think what we've seen in Turkey so far is kind of ramping up, but it is a good question of how long people can stand that. How long will the moments of crisis continue, and what will the next crisis be, and what about the one after that? So I suspect you're right. This moment in world politics kind of shows us that leaders across the world are ramping up the pressure on their constituencies. So I imagine we'll continue to see this for a while. But you're right, that is an Achilles heel, at least in what I'd call a high level of necropolitics, which is what I'm talking about, especially in the last part of that essay. But even in the earlier two essays, that kind of overt use of and even fetishization of death, and particularly death for the nation, probably can only go so far. And it may be also subject to other issues, including the economy. So,
and I think in a strange way, eventually the electorate gets used to it, and it stops being effective as a tool. Because if you see, the moments where Erdogan's utilized this kind of a discourse, you see, with these, military operations in Syria, the 15th of July coup attempt. These are the first things that come to my mind. What you see is that first there's a bump in his approval ratings, but they don't last. Like, they kind of rise up, and at first it's like 10, 20%, then it's 15, and slowly what you see is that at one point, every time he starts to play this card, that his approval ratings don't even go up so high, any longer. That like they just kind of have a very small and insignificant kind of spike in his popularity poll. So it's a strange situation, But at the same time, he seems to be, at least the regime seems to be almost addicted to using this kind of a discourse. I mean, the most recent was right before the pandemic began, with this, discussions around Şehit Tepe and so forth, that Erdogan came out saying that, of course, people are going to die for this country, and this is the right thing to do. How dare, and he was, accusing the opposition politicians, saying, how dare you say that, Şehit Tepe, or the Hill of Martyrs, will be, will remain empty. How dare you how can you say that, So it was, he seems to be using it, but at the same time, it's quite interesting that he hasn't tried to do it so far in the current pandemic. And my kind of, how should I say, opinion about this is that normally he uses this kind of a discourse, he utilizes it when there's an enemy that he can pinpoint and kind of create and vanquish. So he creates these, like enemies that, he says, okay, these are, this part of the population now, we must be careful against them. They're traitors, we must get rid of them. And he creates this kind of a, theater almost, and it lasts for some time. He utilizes this kind of a language. He gets what he wants, and then it's kind of forgotten, put up onto the shelf until the next time, But what we see with the pandemic right now is that for the first time he has an enemy, which seems to be quite difficult for him to kind of, scapegoat or pin up, because it's hard. You can't, there isn't a virus that you can put as a picture. There isn't, it's a very different kind of situation. And you see that like this discourse doesn't seem to be working too well right now,
Yeah, I think you make two fascinating points there, and they actually help to distinguish between rhetorical approaches to necropolitics and maybe action-based approaches that some would classify as necropolitical as well. Because in the Şehit Tepe example, I think Erdogan, my take on it is that, and given the reaction to that, that he kind of misspoke when he said just a few. It wasn't, I mean, people were upset when he said it was just a few who were killed recently. And I think even, I mean, I haven't seen how he reacted to that, but I would imagine that kind of way of belittling the sacrifice doesn't sit well with even his constituents, although his larger point in the poem from which he took that are certainly in line with the kind of necropolitics that he and the AKP have been invested in for many years. But that moment is interesting because I suspect he even wouldn't have said the same thing again. So there's a kind of rhetorical aspect to it that comes clear in that moment. But with the pandemic, I think there's something where we can see, I haven't seen the rhetoric of necropolitics at all now, but you can see the different approaches that certain countries take, and some of them are more in line with with what some of the people in the Bargu book that I'm talking about would call necropolitics not as a departure from biopolitics, but just as the basic flip side to Foucault's biopolitics in the world, in the era of neoliberalism, which is that we just have to be aware of and accept that death is going to come in all kinds of forms, and the sovereign, or the ruler in this case, is not going to protect us from death. In the neoliberal era, some of the theorists talking about necropolitics suggest that it is no longer the goal of governments to try to maintain us in health in the way that Foucault posits in biopolitics, but rather to let us die if necessary. And I think when you see the way that Trump has responded to the coronavirus, and some other countries, including Turkey, where the economy is still a high level, being put very, very much on the forefront, you can see that kind of neoliberal approach that some have called necropolitical. And it's not simple by any means. I don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone can project which of those two routes ultimately would cost more lives, because economies going down really do hurt countries and hurt the people involved as well. But it is an interesting difference in approach from what we might see in other countries, what we're seeing both in the US and in Turkey.
There was this Texan governor, if I'm not mistaken, who was even suggesting that, you know, the senior citizens living in the state of Texas should be prepared to sacrifice their lives for the greater good of American society, you know. And this is it's the Texan Şehit Tepe, you know, of sorts. So I have two more questions that I've just prepared, and these are just notes. So these are just things that that caught my attention. So one of them is that, you know, the question is that governments and regimes, particularly authoritarian ones, have always instrumentalized popular culture to influence public opinion. So, you know, regimes always use, you know, television programs to speak, you know, in a particular way to the public and to prepare public for certain kinds of subjectivities, you know, create opinions and stuff. And, you know, we can at one point read resurrection within this kind of a framework, but it's not quite just this, is it? There's something more, something unique to resurrection. What would you say is the unique aspect of it? Because it's not just trying to influence public opinion, it's about almost trying to create a new public through that public opinion. Or I'm running out of words, you know, vocabulary.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the AKP has had a media strategy that is very, very intelligent in its use of and in creation of publics. And, you know, in other places I've written about the way publics were created at the Democracy Watch is through the use of screens and the clever use of including the actors from Resurrection Ertuğrul there. So I think this is what's going on. There is an attempt here to really create a public that is in line with a set of values. And I think beyond what I have seen before, and I'm sure there are other examples, but I have never seen a text that is so clearly tied with necropolitics. I just had the chance to watch the 5th season of Diriliş Ertuğrul over the past few weeks. I had watched up to season 4 some time ago, but I only watched the 5th season recently. And the emphasis on şehitlik, the emphasis on dying for the nation, the emphasis on sacrifice are profoundly reinforced there time and time again. And so what is unique, I think, in part is that emphasis on death, and in part the way that what I'm calling this prescriptive activation is so overt, and it literally becomes the government message. I mean, the word resurrection was chosen almost certainly as a double message about the AKP and Erdogan. So from the outset, I think the project was conceived in that way. There were some press reports a few years ago that people working on the BİLGİ actually said when Erdogan made a speech, changes were made to the script immediately to have things go in line with it. So that kind of level of coordination, I think, is perhaps unusual, even though there's always been a blending of popular culture. And the degree to which this public, I think the public was certainly created. I don't know how much the public can be sustained. The follow-up to Ertuğrul has not grabbed people the way that Ertuğrul did. So we'll have to kind of see with that.
It's the funny kind of, allusion came to my mind when you were talking about the scripts being modified to Erdogan liking, this is Stalin was a big cinema buff, and he would on occasion, after his soirees in the evening of drinking, Georgian wine and watching, Westerns, he would every once in a while have a go at writing the cinema scripts for the Soviet propaganda machine, Obviously, there's no wine involved in this version, but
Yeah.
the parallels are quite obvious. So we watch Ertuğrul to learn how to die, for the regime. Okay, I think I can agree on that. How does it compare with the other popular culture television series? Because, for instance, there's another very state-sponsored kind of, TV production called Payitaht. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's detailed the last 15 years of Abdülhamit. And if you've taken a look at it, my take on the whole thing is that in Payitaht, what we learn is that, censorship and authoritarianism is something that we need to accept, otherwise, and so forth, So this is this kind of, the messages that is put out over there. Why do you think that the government chooses television series as a medium to communicate these very crucial aspects, or to create consent about these very crucial aspects of their regime? So we're talking about necropolitics, we're talking about istibdad or censorship. So why TV series?
Well, I would even take it a step further and ask why TV series about the past, because there's something very interesting going on with struggles over the Turkish past here. In the general sense, there are other TV serials that are not about the past produced by the government, but I'm not sure how effective many of them have been. And I think both of the shows you're talking about are very affective shows with an A, in the sense that they create a sense of, certainly Ertuğrul creates a sense of affect among viewers. I'm on a couple of viewer groups where people talk about it, and they develop very strong, very personal relationships with these characters. And not only in Turkey, strangely enough, Ertuğrul appeals to a huge group of people internationally. But for the government's purposes, I think television and popular television is kind of an affective window into people's hearts that works in a way that can extend the feeling they already have with someone like Erdogan. And it's no chance thing that Erdogan has been compared to Abdülhamit II many times and is frequently compared to Ertuğrul. So the key character in each of these series has some resonances with Erdogan himself. And in Payitaht, which I've only seen a few episodes of, but I agree with your take on it, for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, the kind of necessity, being implored to or impelled to enact certain authoritarian measures for the good of the greater community. Why these are serial in the past is fascinating as well, because there's this, I think, with Muhteşem Yüzyıl, Magnificent Century, we could see the very stark stakes of the struggle over the Turkish past, the idealized Ottoman past, which the AKP had kind of highlighted in their minds and then found just treated very poorly, at least from their perspective, by Tim's Productions when they made Magnificent Century. So when we're talking about the past, we're talking about a place for national identity, and where story is strong, and where there's a sense of truth that can still be subject to certain kinds of fictionalization and bringing into story that has, therefore, affective registers.
I think the past is like the perfect envelope or the fold into which you can introduce these kind of, revisionist interpretations of identity, of nation building, and so forth. And in regards to Abdülhamit, I mean, it's no wonder, Abdülhamit is Erdogan's favorite, sultan, because if you actually look at, one of perhaps the only person that has ideologically influenced him other than Erbakan, Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, the Islamic author, he has a lot of books out about Abdülhamit, to the point wherein he has, I think, and I think that Erdogan repeats this sentence several times in his, political career. He says, if you want to understand everything, look at Abdülhamit. So it's always, so he uses, or maybe, it's this kind of political Islam discourse that is used and applied to popular culture to reshape it in a certain way. Because, to get back to Diriliş, and this is a little bit, just a stream of consciousness right now.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at Diriliş Ertuğrul without the kind of necropolitical element, what's the difference between it and the Kara Murat films of the 70s and 80s? Not too much,
Okay, yeah. Production quality.
But that also. I mean, obviously, there's no airplanes flying in the background or minibuses, while Kara Murat is fighting off, the Byzantine emperor. But I mean, there is a point over here, I think. Erkan, do you want to say anything, or do you want to add on anything? Because I think that you're also a little bit interested in Necip Fazıl and his effect on shaping the kind of AKP paradigm.
I think something to comment on Josh's. I read Josh's article to be published. As far as I know, it isn't published yet, right, Josh?
No, it is.
Oh,
This one was published a while ago. Yeah.
Okay. So, as you also point out there, I think this, how can I say, reconstruction of in doing the reconstruction of the past, one of the strategies is AKPs is to not like exactly focus on something already very prominent, but less prominent. Like here, Ertuğrul, it's not as popular as Osman Gazi or Abdülhamit or others. So while they create, so they do this creation through construction through a little bit or minor figure. I think it's because it's less contested. So you can, as you mentioned, that's one point. And I remember also this, Kutul Amare. Celebrations, as far as I know, I don't remember much. In the old days, it was given that much of prominence, but now they are selecting some historical moments that aren't exploited that much. So based on secondly, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the concepts you use there. Prescriptive activation, and inspired by Tony Bennett's notion. You differ from him. His concept is productive activation of a text. So you differ from that by prescriptive activation, and by focusing on that, your aim is different. Just a little bit you could elaborate that, then I will ask another question. Then another, in fact, the question. And I commented so far, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. On the first point about Ertuğrul, I think you're absolutely right. There's a second paper I've written that really kind of compares Muhteşem Yüzyıl and Diriliş Ertuğrul, and makes exactly that point, that Ertuğrul was chosen after the government learned its lesson with another serial, which I'll just call, it was called Bursa Osmanlı at one point, it was called Kıyam at another point, I think it had 4 or 5 different names. They tried to get this show out to viewers 4 times, and it failed miserably every time. And judging from what the directors and other people involved with the production, and there were multiple directors, said about their experience, it was something like, with this really documented history, this real sultan, we're talking about the tulip age here, the government didn't want us to actually touch the character very much. So they had to avoid all the taboos. With Muhteşem Yüzyıl, with Magnificent Century, much of the anger and upset about it was over the taboos that were being broken and the showing of the Sultan's personal life. And when you take a figure from actual history and open up the possibility of love relationships, betrayal, etc., or as with Sultan Suleiman, the killing of one's, the execution of friends and family, you open up a lot of potential sore spots that that certain people would rather have not touched. So I think picking Ertuğrul was very strategic from that point of view. You go back in history to a time when literally the only historical thing that attests to Ertuğrul's existence is one coin from the reign of Osman. And then a set of stories came down about Ertuğrul in the 15th century, which historians suggest have a lot to do with the interests of the chroniclers of the 15th century. So there's not written history that talks about Ertuğrul from his own time. And so there's a lot of there's kind of a blank slate to write whatever you wish to on that character. And though they did use the broad trajectories of those 15th century historical accounts, they had plenty of room to write a lot of other stuff on top of it. So I think that was an interesting choice. And maybe it explains to some degree why Osman, the follow-up serial, hasn't, as far as yet, been quite as successful. There may be some taboos attached to Osman. I've only watched the first 2 episodes of that, so I can't say where they've gotten with episode 15 or 17, wherever they are right now. But that may be part of it. So that, I hope that gets at one of your points. The other one on prescriptive activation, yeah, Tony Bennett is just kind of the notion of productive activation was one that I had used in other work, especially ethnographic work. I find it very helpful to talk about the way people engage with texts, and his notion of productive activation is very useful there. I was just trying to come up with something that explained what I saw with Ertuğrul was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The level of coordination between the government and the text, the level to which the actors were called forth again and again to play these parts. And whether it be in live situations or on television, etc. There is something interesting when frequently a text is left to kind of stand for itself. The political messages are clear, they're part of it. You can easily read that subtext, and you can do that with Ertuğrul. But when the government takes the extra effort, time and time again, to put this out there, when the theme song from the show becomes the theme song for the AKP, in many ways, I mean, along with Dombra, there's something interesting happening here. And I thought we need some way to think about this, to handle it. So that concept of prescriptive activation for me, I think is for any time when the maker of a text tries very forcefully to assert control to the degree possible over its reception and its uptake in broader publics. And I think we see it here. I don't know I haven't thought where else I can use this term, but I think it's pretty clear in this case.
It adds like a magical quality almost to the kind of meetings and in this democracy watches and stuff. Just the melody or the music kind of creates an enchanting atmosphere, and that's like fascinating. That almost imports the series aesthetics into real life and transforms it. And it's a very interesting way to look at it. It's fascinating. One more thing that I had in mind. Oh.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ivo.
No, I was just listening. It was just a comment. It creates the magic is real moment in a strange way.
it's interesting to note that music. I mean, I live in Lebanon, and the music from Diriliş Ertuğrul was used and overwritten with Arabic words in the revolution or the protest movement that took place this fall. So I was hearing that music at the protests on the streets of Lebanon with Arabic words about the protests. And I went on a tour of Ertuğrul's tomb earlier this when I was in Turkey in the spring with viewers who were from abroad. They offer tours of his tomb that you can take from Istanbul. And the tour guide played the Ertuğrul theme song as we got in. And then when he switched to the theme song from the new Osman series, everyone was let down and upset by it, because it doesn't have the same kind of, it doesn't instill the same kind of engagement at all. There's something very effective about the tomb itself. And again, the AKP's media strategy with that song and with Domino at the rallies is, both of them are absolutely effective earworms in terms of getting there and sticking with you.
And yeah, the associations they create, maybe the new theme song needs a new crisis to kind of, be latched onto, so that, can kind of recreate that moment in their minds, of the listeners.
Yeah.
Erkan, you want to say something?
Just a follow-up question, maybe. But to what extent you think they can really shape the impact of the series? There's a huge literature on how audiences are reproduce or change the way a message is sent, different interpretations. Here at some point it seems that at least this Ertuğrul is the best take they had, the government had, that that its ratings were high. And I know that you are not exactly into the audience side of it, but still, how do you think that this prescriptive well, I'm sorry, the term activation work, to what extent it could be efficiently performed? What do you think?
Or recreated even, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Oh. Are you done, Erkan? I can't tell because the sound comes and goes.
No, I'm here. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. No, I wasn't sure if you were finished with the question, but I think it's a great question. I think what I'm going for with the exploration of Ertuğrul is a bit different than the kind of attempts to forge in audiences a particular understanding of a text. I think what's happening here is broader than just the understanding of a text. I think the understanding of a text is there, and probably it does have a large effect on that, but I don't know. I haven't done ethnographic work with viewers of Diriliş Ertuğrul to be able to assess it very much. I think what's more interesting here is the kind of use of the theme song and the use of the characters at rallies and on other media platforms, like the Yeni Şafak example with the character who plays Bamsi Beyrak, Nurettin Sönmez, I think, which are attempts to elicit a kind of political affect that then can go in line with whatever message has been picked up from the Dizi. And again, this would need exploration with ethnographic work or other means to kind of to explore further. But I can say that I've done a little bit of work with online communities, and the extent to which people who profess to be fans of the show and join a fan group, or those who post videos about Ertuğrul in particular, and videos, the extent to which their professed ideology is in line with the show, their love of the characters is in line with the show, and their support of Erdogan and the government is in line with the show, are very, very clear. So So there are pieces of evidence we can see without ethnographic exploration that kind of show this. Some aspects of what happens as a result of the show, and I would say as a result of its prescriptive activation as well.
In a strange way, and this is, maybe one thing that's been in my mind and it's been kind of itching away in my head, is that like the effects of these kind of shows can be also felt in the kind of, how should I say, change in culture. And for instance, there's like, one thing that I don't know how to connect it to the overall discussion, but I think there's some sort of a link here, is in the same period. So we are seeing, especially, after Gezi and then after this, 15th of July, coup attempt, we see Istanbul, or the urban spaces of Istanbul, being, renamed, and also kind of being kind of transformed by this kind of a discourse. So increasingly we're seeing, public squares, bus stops, police cars, just trying to think of, even ferry boats, are being, renamed, or, by these, people that supposedly have died that we've never heard about, but that they seem to have some sort of relevance, in a strange way. I think these kind of series and the kind of necropolitical kind of turn in culture that these series kind of cause also have some sort of an effect on urban environments and the way they are experienced. Increasingly, sometimes I feel, the bridge is also kind of renamed like this now, also after the people who died, during the coup attempt. We're increasingly kind of seeing, and I don't know how it kind of all of these pieces fit together, but we're increasingly seeing Istanbul turning into some sort of a necropolis of some sort, that the names of these spaces and the way they're kind of, experienced in public life. I don't know. This, I guess it was a bit of a random comment, but it's been on my mind all the time, and, because they seem to be working hand in hand. I mean, I've noticed, and it almost feels like there's a hierarchy of death or martyrdom mandated by this kind of politics, that if you are somebody high up, or if you are, for instance, a judge, you get, a building named after you. But if you're just, an ordinary soldier that died, you get like a bus stop named after you, or something like that. There's something very strange happening over here, according to the importance that the regime places on you as a citizen and your death, that you get placed in these kind of things, that you end up transforming urban environments. Yeah,
I think you're right. And I would say, just because I finished the book this morning, there's a chapter in the Banu Bargu book that's dealing with this to some degree by Lerna Yanık and Fulya Hisarlıoğlu, about necropolitical spaces and the everyday spatial politics of death in Turkey, where they're talking about, among other things, the way places have been renamed and structured around death. And Timur Hamid has done some work on this as well. So it's a phenomenon that you're absolutely right to point out. I think that everyday presence of death is becoming more and more palpable to us, certainly in Istanbul and after the coup attempt in many other cities as well.
And it's a strange feeling when the bus stop that you use to get to work suddenly changes its name to Martyr something, and you're like, you actually have to look it up on the internet to find out who this person is,
Yeah, well, and I walked by one of the Tolmas, is that what the water vehicle is called? The other day, noticed it was named after a Shahid as well. So, I mean,
it's a popular practice. Erkan, do you have any comments that you wish to make before we turn and open the floor up to questions from the audience?
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, so I think let's hear from the audience a little bit, and I think there was a little bit of a discussion. Atinç had some comments. So if you have any comments or any questions that you wish to address to Josh, please do so right now in the live comment section. Let's hope this works.
I do see the point that Atinç made, one point to recognize the ideal of New Turkey and its relation to systematically forgotten and disowned past AKP, I believe, attempt to own the past to create New Turkey ideal. I think New Turkey is absolutely fundamentally tied in with a vision of the past. You're absolutely right. I think going back to the past is a way to legitimize a vision for what New Turkey might be. And these two kind of serve to constantly re-legitimize each other in various ways. I mean, again, Yeniden Diriliş, Yeniden Yükseliş as a motto a few years back, just being one of many, many cases. So I don't know how, I've heard from friends who live here, because I no longer live in Istanbul, that the rhetoric of Yeni Türkiye has gotten a little bit tiresome and maybe is not being used as much these days, and I can't speak to that. But I think the project is still certainly there, and the mutually constituted relationship between a kind of past and this notion of the new Turkey is very clear. So I think it's a great point.
I mean, the allure of Yeni Türkiye has definitely worn off a little bit with the economic crises. So
Yeah.
But increasingly, I mean, also Erdogan's politics and the way he's kind of embraced some of the more kind of, how should I say, depressing sides of the former, Kemalist tutelage regime, of these, and it's his relationship with the army and stuff. Increasingly, I mean, is it New Turkey or is it old New Turkey?
Yeah.
So it's really beginning to feel like it's something else right now.
Yeah, I think we may see the limits of this kind of effective politics at some point. I mean, exhaustion begins to set in amongst people eventually, especially when you depend on heavily effective appeals for your political message. Aslı Tunç asks, the same attempt to idealize martyrs is very similar to Iran and its political past. Do you have any comparative thoughts? I don't know a whole lot about the situation in Iran, Aslı, so I don't know if I can speak on the situation comparatively. Although I suspect that's true. I mean, I have a friend who works on Iran, and he has told me that what you say is absolutely the case. But I don't know a whole lot about the situation of martyrdom in Iran or how it's mediated either. So I don't know if the forum permits further, if you can contribute any more, because it's an interesting topic.
Do the Iranians have their own Diriliş Ertuğrul? Maybe is a better way to ask the question.
I think they did, but
I'll have to ask a colleague.
as a side comment, also idealizing death, it was also, I think, in the old days, it happened in the radical left groups too, and some groups still, I think, romanticize it. So a kind of martyrdom culture is around, but this is a wider scale what AKP does at the moment, I guess. But there might be at some point some other connections to the past, near past of Turkey, maybe some political groups and movements, etc. That's just.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the situation, what we call necropolitics, is certainly there's in the past of Turkey, there's much to draw on for that. So I don't think this is an entirely new innovation by the AKP at all. And both on the left and on the right, there have been various forms of it. Again, in this excellent collection edited by Banu Bargu, they're talking about the various forms of necropolitics that are used in reaction to more powerful regimes by leftist forces, and even talking about a kind of the necropolitics of fasting until death, which is a way of using death against the regime itself. So it's not a tool that is only held in the hands of the sovereign or the ruling power, but it has a particularly strong effect, or a strong, it's particularly potent when it's in those very powerful hands. And I think it's even more potent when it's brought into popular culture in the way it's being brought in now.
When a political will instrumentalizes death is when necropolitics is very effective, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this,
yeah.
Upon this, how should I say, positive and upbeat note, does anybody from the audience have any further questions to ask or any thoughts they wish to share with us? Just a few more minutes. If we don't have anybody that's... what's that, Erkan?
If there are no questions, everything was very clear.
Okay, so then if everything seems to be crystal clear and there are no questions, then I think we can finish up for today. Josh, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I wish to thank you on behalf of our department for being here and being able to participate. I wish we could host you at our university, but unfortunately we couldn't do so. Yeah, so thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, all of you, both of you, for organizing it, and all of the people who listened. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and to hear back from you.
There's some final questions, I think. Hold on. So Noor is, yeah.
So, okay. Wow, I see a whole bunch of them here. Yeah, all of a sudden.
It's always like this. The minute you say you're finishing up, people start to ask questions.
This is not a question, just thank you note. Yeah. And our dean also thanks us. So no more questions, just thanks. And maybe just, it was Noor's question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to have to say I don't know a lot about the Egyptian situation. That's a great question. I wish we had the ability to listen to what Noor and Atla had to contribute here, because it sounds like we could have a very interesting discussion, but I don't think the forum allows that.
The irony is that the Egyptian general now in charge is like Erdogan's arch nemesis, you know. So it's funny that he's aping the Erdogan's tactics.
Yeah. So I hope to hear. I hope maybe via email or some other form to hear more from both Noor and Asla about the comparative possibilities here, because those sound fascinating.
Josh, maybe you can share your email or just say it out loud. So if people want to send you a message, you know, after the talk, it might be useful.
Yeah,
Erkan, maybe you can just post it. You know.
Yeah, what was the private? Send me the email. I will just do it. Can you?
Okay. Can you guys see that there?
Let me see. Where?
Oh, I tried to share the screen, but I guess it didn't work. It's. I'll send you.
Sorry. There it is. Yeah.
All right. Perfect.
Okay then.
And I sent it in the private chat as well. There it goes.
Yeah, I got it, and here it is. I'm using some of the tools here. Oh, here it is. See what I did.
Oh wow! Okay.
I'm learning this. Okay, my next career will be in on the Regi room or whatever it's called. But yeah. Okay, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you, and have a good evening.
Bye bye.
Cheers. Enjoy your evening. Bye bye.
Bye bye.